The hall still smelled of oil and dust and cold iron. Sunlight, thin and sour as watered wine, slanted through the high windows in narrow blades that left most of the throne room in gloom. The iron throne's knives and spikes drank those beams without ever shining. The boy sat on that ugly heap, thin legs lost beneath a crimson robe, a stubborn line set in his mouth that belonged to his mother. Circe stood at his right hand with her chin lifted high. Every ring she wore meant for a different throat. Ser Boros and Ser Marin lounged like fat cats by the steps with their white cloaks and dull eyes. Lord Varys had folded his hands like a patient nurse. Janos Slint, all brute face and heavy jaw, the scales of the city watch glimmering in his cloak's clasp, was just behind them with a tide of gold cloaks swollen thick along the walls. Eddard Stark's leg ached with each step. He did not show his pain. He moved with his men. The dark leathers and gray will set them apart from gilded silk. The chill of the north walking bareheaded through summer's rot. The Lord of Winterfell had not brought ice. That would have been a statement, and Ned had never cared for statements. He had a plain longsword at his hip, good steel, Stark steel. Harwin walked at his shoulder, jaw clenched, eyes moving like a scout's. Desmond and Cain and Jax were near, grim as nightfall. They had scrubbed the ash and blood from their gear for all the good it did. It clung to them still. He felt the weight of Robert's last words in the pocket of his memory. He felt how soft they were when set against iron. Ned presented the parchment like a banner. He stood before the boy and the mother and spoke in a voice that laid no claim to thunder. He told them what he would do, and what the late king had commanded, and how the realm would be kept safe until the rightful heir should come to claim what law afforded him. The letters black on vellum seemed smaller here in the cathedral shadow of the hall, but he had not come to win with size, only with truth. Circe smiled with the tilt of a fox's head. She took the parchment from his hand with those slim fingers, those lion's claws filed fine, and tore it in two, then 4, then 8. The pieces fell like pale leaves and she let them. The boy on the throne watched each scrap drift. He smiled, a mean small thing, as if the tearing were a game and every leaf a bird he had put to flight with a pebble. For a heartbeat the hall heard nothing. Then it heard the scrape and hush of the city watch shifting, and the leather squeal of hands finding hilts. Ned's own men stiffened like hounds feeling a storm bump the horizon. Janos Slint pushed his jaw forward, and Lord Varys's eyes slid towards nowhere. Lord Stark. The soft voice came from his left, from a shadow that wore a smile like it had been polished. Peter Baelish looked like a man given to jest, to wine cups and whispers. He had been useful in this nest of vipers. Nimble hands to untie knots, nimble tongue to tell him who knotted them. Now those nimble hands slid behind Eddard's shoulder, came up like a striking snake, and cold kissed his throat as steel found the hollow just beneath his ear. "I told you once," Peter murmured, breath warm like a lie. "Not to trust." Eddard did not think. Later he would think of his father beneath the weirwood, and of a boy's voice telling a man's oath. The one who judges should swing the sword. There was no time for that now. He felt the knife and felt the leg and felt the stone beneath his boot. He pivoted hard into the hurt. Peter's blade scraped, sliced skin and more than skin, but the angle broke. Eddard's elbow drove back with the old practice of the yard, ironwork remembered by bone more than mind. It slammed into soft belly. Baelish lost breath and leverage both. Ned's left hand caught the wrist that held the dagger and twisted. He heard a whine he'd once heard from a trapped fox. "Harwin," Ned said. There was no call for flourish. Harwin's sword came down in the same breath. For a moment Peter's eyes were very wide and very blue, like a sky looking back at itself in a still pool. Harwin's blade took him clean at the neck. The sound in the hall was a wet, surprised thing. Blood ran quick and dark and not at all like wine. The head bounced once upon the flagstones and rolled towards the foot of the throne, mouth still parted around a word that had no more time in this world. Ned released the slack wrist and let the hand with the knife fall. It hit with a little clatter that would go on ringing for years. "In the name of the late king, Peter Baelish has met the law for treason," Eddard said, though he felt the sentence cut him as well. The man who gave the judgment had not swung the sword. He would carry that breach like a stone in his boot until the day he was laid in earth. Cersei's face did not change. The boy's did. He was nothing but a face. Boy smooth and cruel all at once, crumpling and then sharpening as if some smith within him hammered it between whim and wrath. Slint's shout broke against the stone like surf, and the gold cloaks flowed forward. Everything moved fast after that, with a clarity that was less seeing than knowing where the edges were. Harwin jerked his blade free of Baelish's corpse. Desmond had his shield up and took the first rush like a door that holds for a heartbeat only to stall the flood. Ned stepped back, the ache in his leg now a hot thread. He saw Barristan Selmy's white head half-turned, saw the old knight measuring honor like a coin that would not spend either way. Ser Meryn grinned, the slack grin of a man who liked breaking things, and came on. Cain parried once, twice, then staggered as a third gold cloak drove a short spear into his ribs with a grunt that was almost embarrassed. The hall became the sound of breath and steel and a river of boots. "Hold!" Barristan's voice cut across the din. "Old iron on old iron. Hold, in the king's name. Kill the wolves," Janos Slint roared. "And take the hand alive," pleased the boy. That was enough. A gold cloak lunged for Ned. Harwin's blade interposed. The man fell away with a thunk in his throat and his hand to it like he thought to convince his blood to stay. Ned felt heat on his neck where the dagger had scored him, felt it trickle beneath his collar. He tasted copper. He looked up and saw the Iron Throne's knives, each tooth with a story that had not ended well. "Back!" Ned snapped, and Harwin knew where he meant without need of words. They moved not towards the doors, where the watch swelled, but towards the side passage that led to the shadows of the gallery, and from there to the steps that wound like a serpent up to the Tower of the Hand. Two men fell closing that hole. Desmond's voice, "For the North," was not a battle cry so much as a word he used to remind himself why he was here, and he took a spear in the thigh for it and kept walking as if poleaxed and stubborn in equal measure. They might have died 3 times between the dais and the arch, but they did not. The gods were watching or not. It hardly mattered. Barristan's hold became a command for a breath. The old man's presence alone stilled half a dozen blows. Slint's men had bought courage with coin and drank it as quickly, and for a moment the spilling of one soft lordling's blood had taken more from them than the bribe had given. Meryn Trant's sword cut the air where Ned's throat had been a heartbeat earlier. Harwin's pommel found Meryn's jaw, and the king's dog stumbled with a curse. Varys had already vanished, which was either his duty or his nature. Then they were through the arch and into the gloom of the passage. Torches smoked in iron brackets, and the air tasted of damp stone and old wax. Harwin shoved a bench into the doorway with a crash that bought seconds. The seconds were enough. They ran, and for all Ned's old wound and knew he kept with them, each step a vow paid for after the manner of vows, dear. At the base of the stair they met Yoren, as thin as a clothes horse and smelling of horse on a hot day. The black cloak marked him, but it was his eyes that mattered. They were the eyes of a man who told truths that had to be told and hid truths that had to be hid. "Bad smell in there," Yoren said, voice dry with disuse. He'd a hand beneath his cloak as if warming it, but Ned knew a knife when he saw someone loving it in the dark. "Girl's where I put her. Old dancing masters bought her time, though he's buying dear." Ned closed his eyes once. "Keep her hid," he said. "No heroics. If you can get her out, do it. If not, keep her in shadow." "I've taken worse packages north," Yoren said, and flicked his eyes at Harwin's sleeve, black with blood to the elbow. "You're leaking." "It's not mine," Harwin lied. Ned nodded once. "There'll be riders at nightfall. Can you have passage arranged?" The night's watchman's mouth quirked as if that were a jest. "I'm a humble crow, M-Lord, but there's always a rat hole or two. You just don't like how they smell." "Do it," Ned said, and was already moving, already seeing the turns ahead of him. There was a window, there was a door that opened onto a step shaft not meant for lords. There were hands he could ask for that would ask no coin and want no song for their work. They reached the Tower of the Hand on legs made from ash, barred the doors, and listened to the city scuff and mutter to itself beyond the stone. Ned let the breath leave him like a weight. He bound his neck where the cut had smiled red. He cleansed his hands. Harwin stood guard with Desmond, who would not allow himself a chair, and Cain lay on a bench with his breath counting down without his leave. When Varys came through the wall, it was not much of a surprise. The secret passages of the Red Keep were a rumor to some, a diagram to others, and a home to one man in particular. The eunuch slid out of darkness like a soft knife that had remembered kindness. "Lord Stark," he said, "our city has been cruel to you." "Truth is not cruelty," Ned answered, and rubbed a thumb along the edge of the desk. "Came away gritty. Peter's dead." Varys inclined his smooth head. "Yes." His voice had no weather in it. "You have lanced a boil and let the poison in. There will be fever. Some fevers kill, some save. I can't bleed the city." Ned let his eyes rest on the wall where his wife's banner might have hung if he had been the sort to hang banners. "Then you must leave it," Varys murmured. "Quietly, at once. With your girl, if the gods are kind. The queen means to send you to the dungeons by dusk and to the headsman by dawn. She has your other daughter under lock and compliments and does not yet understand that wolves bite nearest when they bleed." Ned stood. The leg hurt. It would always hurt. He was used to it. The realm needs a lord protector, not a charnel house with a boy on a chair. Stannis will do as law demands. I wrote to him. I'll go to him. If anyone will take me into the belly of the city to a ship with oars and no penance, I'll bless him in the old tongue and owe him in the new. "I will take you," Varys said, "but not because I love you. I do not love anyone." He smiled then, the smile of a baker who had learned what hunger did to men. "This place is a fire. I have plans that do not need this fire to die yet. You're leaving May by the fuel more time to burn." "I do not care for your plans," Ned said. "I care for my daughters and for the king's law." "We are both fools," Varys said amiably, "but I have long found that fools do more for the realm than clever men. Clever men do things to the realm." They went into the walls together as the city wailed outside, ghosts in a keep made from a mad king's secrets. In a long, low room that smelled of spilled wine and old rushes and a little of winter, Sansa Stark held her hands clasped at her breast and tried to remember how to breathe quietly, beautifully, as a lady ought. It was not easy. The queen had stroked her hair with fingers that had no weight to them and said such pleasant things with such a low voice. They had given her honeyed milk and almond cakes with sugared violets on top, and she had taken them with thanks and swallowed around the taste that had nothing to do with almonds. On a window ledge, a pale bird pecked at crumbs and cocked its head as if it were listening to the room like a courtier. Joffrey had not come. Perhaps he was occupied with kingly business. Perhaps he had not thought of her. Perhaps he had, and that was worse. She held her hands and let her head be heavy enough to let her hair hide her face, and in that little dark she named the things she missed. The smell of snow under pine. Arya slamming a door like a wild thing. The sound of her father's footfalls in a hall that knew how to keep its sounds and give them back softly. The songs that said how true knights behaved. When the hound came, he came like silence, with that scar that cut his face in two and made the good half look like a mask. He did not bow. He did not smile. He looked at her as if she were an arrow he had taken from his own chest and might not yet decide whether to break it or put it back. "You have blood on your sleeve," he said, which was untrue. It took her a startled moment to see he meant the color of her gown. "Pretty. It suits this place." She swallowed. "I am to wed the king," she said, "because if you say the thing that is supposed to be true often enough it begins to sound like a lullaby, and lullabies are for soothing." He stared at her a long time, and the sound her heart made grew very large in her ears. "The hall smells of blood," he said at last. "More than usual. Your little spider has scuttled and your pretty bird has flown." He tilted his head. "Do you like it here?" She thought of her father's face, of the way the lines near his eyes deepened when he was pleased with a thing she had done. How rare that had seemed to her then. How precious it seemed now. "I like being a lady," she said, "because ladies tell no lies. I like songs. I like kindness." The hound's mouth bent. Kindness is a sword with no edge here. He left her then, and she stood a while and watched the pale bird peck, and began to understand that there were songs even the singers had not dared learn. Arya Stark ran. She ran through smoke that smelled of tallow and burned lint, through light that came like knives through the slits in the stone, through the taste of iron she could not get out of her mouth. Syrio Farrell had told her to run, and he had told her again when the men in white cloaks had come, and he had stood with his wooden sword like a man who had decided that wood was better than steel when a god was watching. He'd smiled at her. A real smile, a smile that had every tooth in it and all his fierce calm. And she had run because he told her to and because he had taught her that an order is a gift if it saves your life. Yoren's hand clamped over her mouth before the scream could jump out. "Don't," he whispered. "Girl, don't." His breath smelled like onions and old smoke in the road, and at first she thought it was a bad smell. Then it smelled like home, which was wrong. "They'll kill him," she hissed. "They'll?" "Maybe," Yoren said. "Maybe he'll kill them. You're not steel, and neither am I. We're straw and chaff and rats. We live because they don't see us. Come on." They went down and down and down, and the red keep became a hill of stone above their heads, and the air grew wet and tasted like the river even before they could hear it. Yoren knew where a boatman would take coin without counting too closely the face that handed it, and Arya knew where a boy could become a nobody. Yoren cut her hair with a knife that had done 100 mean jobs and would do 100 more. It shorted her like a summer storm had come through. He wiped the hair away with his palm and blew at what clung, and then the girl who had danced in a long room with a man from the sea was gone, and a boy who had dirt in his nails and a hard stare where his father's softness had been was left. "What's your name?" Yoren said. "Arya," she answered without thinking. He sighed. "Not today you ain't." He pointed with his chin. "Tell me your name, boy." "Aerie," she said, and felt it stick in her teeth. Aerie Rivers. That was a name for bastards, and why shouldn't she be a bastard? Bastards could run and not be looked for. Yoren grunted. "Fair enough. Aerie, I got no time to hold your hand. You keep your head down. You do what I say when I say. You don't stick anyone with your pin unless you can run after, and don't run unless I say. If we come to a choice, you jump before you think." "I'll be thinking." She remembered her father, his big hand on her shoulder, the weight of it, the safety of it. She nodded. She kept the tears back with her teeth. On the day the sea went iron and dull as a shield, Davos Seaworth stood atop Dragonstone's windknife walls and watched a black speck in the vista grow until it became a cog with tired sails and a weary soul. The air here always tasted of ash, as if the mountain coughed even when it slept. The carved dragons of the castle squatted in their perches and stared with blind disdain at whatever came and went. Storms hulkied on the horizon like kings that had died and not been told. Davos had never stopped loving the sea because the sea had never once lied to him. It said plainly when it would drown him and plainly when it would carry him, and if a man couldn't read that language, he deserved what he got. The king waited in his long room with its painted table that turned the world into a toy. Stannis Baratheon did not sit well. He perched like a man ready to rise and face a thing that had made him angry by existing. The Red Woman stood like a shadow made of fire. She wore a look that asked questions men burned answering. "They came ashore with no sigil," Davos said when the hand of the late king stepped into the long room and smelled the smoke and salt and certainty that lived there. The Northern Lord's beard had silver threaded through black, and his eyes looked like ice that had learned patience from rock. He bowed less than the Red Priestess wanted and more than the king needed. "Eddard Stark," Stannis said, and the name made the room colder. "Are you a man who loves law, my lord, or a man who loves the idea of it?" "I love the thing itself, your grace," Ned said like a man laying a board across a creek to keep feet dry. Stannis's mouth twitched. He was a man with a mouth that hated to twitch. "Then you will give me what's mine and help me take what's mine, and we will be done with lies." "The boy in the city is no true king," Ned said. "You know why." "I know," Stannis said. "I knew before the boar took Robert. The city knows a little and believes nothing." He looked at the woman in red without looking at her, the way a man looks at a flame in his house. acknowledging it because ignoring it burnt worse. The truth is a sword that rusts in salt air. We will hoist it high anyway. Melisandre's voice came like a song sung low to a child who had no intention of sleeping. Truth is fire, your grace. It burns away lies. It burns away mercy that keeps men sick. The false queen. Ned looked at her and said nothing. He had never cared for priests who spoke as if they were gods. He had knelt beneath the boughs of a weirwood and let a silent face watch him ask for strength to live rightly. He had not always lived rightly. The tree had watched that too. I will not burn women to make the air taste better, Ned said. And I will not put crowns on heads because a god made a dancing light for me. Stannis studied him as if he were a map with a river no other scribe H. Adron. Good, he said at last. I do not like puppets, whatever hand wears them. You will serve as hand until we break the dragon's stone chains and ride for the city. Whether you serve longer will depend on whether you and I find one another intolerable. I have a daughter held by lions, Ned said. The words were a stone in his mouth. I have another who may be out past the city by now if the Night's Watch keeps their word and their wits. I will not be hand to a king who thinks daughters are coin. Stannis glanced at Davos. Davos had to look down to keep his face from telling his king every thought it held. Stannis had a daughter. The girl limped around the high rooms with a face the world had finger-painted and a laugh like winter sun. Stannis looked at her as a man looks at his own mistakes and says the world made them. It did not mean he did not love her. It meant he had made an armor that rusted him. We will take the city, Stannis said. We will take your daughter from it. We will take the heads that need taking and leave the ones that do not. Your wolf will be returned to you. Better I return her than the boy in crimson keep her. Davos heard the words and knew he had taken another step along a road he had never asked to walk. He was a smuggler who had smuggled onions into a starving castle and found himself knighted and short some fingers because a just man held law like a blade. Now the blade would try to cut a crown that had been hammered crooked. He did not like what the Red Woman liked. He did not like the sound of the old gods either, but he liked men who kept their promises and paid what they owed. Stannis Baratheon owed the realm a king. Eddard Stark owed his girls a father. Catelyn Stark rode beneath oaks that had looked on at men's foolishness for centuries and never thought it worth a rustle. The air in the riverlands tasted of water and ash both these days. Fires moved where men moved, and where men took bread they left stories that nobody wanted to tell their children. Riverrun had opened its gates to her with the small bitter joy of a place that had not fallen yet while towns near it died quietly and were not missed by anyone with banners. When the raven came and sat down like spilled ink on the sill of her chamber, her hands had shaken as she untied the letter. She did not shake much anymore. The world did not allow it. Ned's hand made itself known even without his name beneath the lines. He wrote like a man cutting wood. Each stroke had a purpose. He told her he lived. He told her what he had done, and she felt the shock of it with a strange, guilty pleasure, as if sometimes the gods gave you back the husband you had loved as a girl, the one who had been capable of a sudden act that would ring for years. He told her he was at Dragonstone. He told her he had bent his back to Stannis' cause because law was not a thing they could keep in Winterfell like a black cloak. It belonged to the realm or it was nothing. He told her to keep their son's feet out of the traps men would dig for him. He told her to keep Sansa in her prayers and Arya in her dreams. She rode to the Godswood because the air under leaves was the only air she could breathe with her throat open. Her father's gods did not live here. Hers had never lived in Winterfell. She had knelt before a carved mother holding a child before she took Ned's hand. And the gods she'd learned in the cold had been trees with faces that said nothing. A woman learns to pray to whatever listens when fear has a tasty story to tell. In the Godswood of Riverrun the weirwood grew not so broad as Winterfell's, but broad enough to know secrets. She laid Ned's letter in its roots. "Keep him," she said simply, and the leaves shivered without a wind. Robb stood behind her like a tower the masons had not finished. He was too young. She could not stop seeing the boy in him. She could not stop seeing the man either. That was worse. Grey wind nosed his hand and then her elbow, as if to remind them that oaths were a kind of hunting and the wolf would like to be told which trail to take. "Father lives," Rob said, and even his voice did not know whether to be glad or bitter. "He killed him. He killed a man who would have killed him and 100 others," Caitlin said, knowing it would sound like justification. A cloth laid over blood because even mothers could not look at it forever. "He did what had to be done. Then we ride to him," Rob said, with that quick heat that made her think of the boy who had fallen in a snowdrift at 10 and stood again laughing with his teeth blue from cold. "We take the river lords who will come, and we take the twins from the phrase with words if we can and swords if not, and we go to him and put our banners under Stannis's if that's what father says. We'll take grandfather's strength. Your grandfather lies in his bed and waits," Caitlin said. "He will not ride, and if he did, his body would stay where it fell. The riverlands burn. Your uncle Edmure holds the fords. Your other uncle rides to bring the outlying castles in. Every rider we take for honor is a rider lost to the fires, and there are children in those flames." Rob met her eyes and looked away, as if the gaze itself was a knife. "We can't sit." "No," she agreed, "but we can choose where we stand. Your father asks that we not let ourselves be lured where we are weakest. We will send word to the lords of the Trident. We will tell them Stannis holds Dragonstone and the law in his hand. We will make of this a host the lions cannot simply eat in the field. We will not proclaim you a king because the realm needs a lawful one, and Stannis will be that if we help him be. We will ride, but we will ride with our heads, not our throats." He looked at her then as if she had taken something from him and replaced it with iron. She had. Sometimes a mother does what the realm would not ask its fathers to do, because someone must do it. Tyrion Lannister bounced in a saddle that had not been designed for dwarfs, and wore dust like a man wears a brother's old cloak out of necessity, not fondness. He and Bronn rode with a lean pack of sellswords who smelled of old leather and success, meaning they were alive. It was not a fragrance the Seven would bottle. He had been freed by a mad sky and a woman's misjudgment, and he'd come to a father who had never been good at seeing him with any eyes except a bookkeeper's or a butcher's. The Riverlands were a map he had walked into and now could not quite walk out of. He had learned that he could make a sellsword laugh and that he could make a rider of the mountain take a step back in the right words if those words were sharpened and thrown correctly. He had also learned that most men preferred steel to sentences when it came time to divide a loaf. "Your sisters made a mess," Tywin had told him, and Tyrion had known at once that the mess had less to do with Cersei's choices than with the fact that a bolt of fate had stuck in the wrong lordling and had now become nicked by treason. "You'll go to King's Landing and be hand. You'll make the city not fall. You'll make my grandson a king whose crown doesn't slip every time he sneers. You'll keep your head. If you don't, I'll kick it up the steps of the rock myself." "Fatherly affection warms me," Tyrion had said, and Tywin had smiled with his eyes closed. Now he rode, and the fields on either side of the road smoked like the gods had sent a deliberate fog to hide what men made of each other. Bronn spat and wiped his mouth and said nothing. It was Bronn's best voice. Tyrion looked up when a raven cut the sky and thought of the way Cersei tore paper as a woman might tear an old gown she meant to throw out. Sometimes the thing you tore had been holding you together and you only learned it when the air hit your skin. When he reached the city at last, it smelled like always. Piss, garlic, tar, hot iron, hot breath. The walls were men that would not break if you shouted and would break if you paid them. The bells were quiet, but the quiet had a sound. He went to the Tower of the Hand and found dust where Peter should have been and a hole where coin should have been and his sister wearing fear like perfume under all her other perfumes. "You came," Cersei said, and the words were not warm enough to cook an egg. "I always do what I must," he said and let his eyes take stock. "Things here are worse than usual, which is remarkable, as usual in this city is a note sung just this side of screaming. You've lost the Lord of Coin, and with him, the grace of half the debtors you've been dancing with. You've lost the hand. You've kept the boy who thinks crowns are toys and laws are chairs. You will fix this," Cersei said. "I will do what I can," Tyrion said, which meant something if a man meant it and nothing at all in most mouths. He sent for the alchemists and let them be delighted quite out loud until they showed him the green fire that ate would like wolves ate lambs. He sent for men whose loyalty was not for sale because there were none. He bought other men whose loyalty was, and told himself he was buying time with counterfeit coins stamped with his wit instead of a king's face. He wrote to Highgarden because there was a gardener for every weed and each had a whetstone near at hand. His courier returned with nothing soft. The Tyrell rose leaned, for the moment, over Renly's camp, and Renly's laugh drew bees. Tyrion did not know if he admired Renly or despised him. Perhaps both. Perhaps Renly was the sort of man that the world had lately decided to love because he gave them prettier lies than Stannis warmed in his honest scowl. He went to the guild halls and the granaries and the shipyards. He stroked backs. He threatened sergeants. He drank less than he wanted. He listened to Varys when Varys appeared, and pretended to ignore him when Varys did not. He saw Joffrey kill a cat with a new crossbow because it had looked at him, and he sent the boys' swaggering friends away with the sort of smile that told them they were in danger of being amused. He saw Sansa Stark look at a wall because she could not look anywhere else that would not choke her. He made himself be gentle to her. It hurt more than being rough. "War is easy," Tyrion said to Bronn one night, sitting with his feet dangling off a parapet and watching the river collect the city's sins and carry them to the bay. "People are hard. War kills people," Bronn said. "That's the easy bit." Winterfell's courtyards kept a good echo even when they were empty. Jon Snow heard his own Boothiels and remembered hearing other men's and never being able to catch up. The wall had given him a different sound, the endless low moan of wind that needed no company. He was learning the wind's language, and it made him feel both less and more alone. The raven came with a letter from his mother's sister's husband. That was how he thought of Eddard Stark because the wall made men name their fathers carefully in their minds. He read Ned's words and felt something like a hand tugging at the rope that moored him to himself. "My lord father lives," Robb said when Jon found him in the great hall where someone had set new rushes and a new fire as if to insist Winterfell could be new. His half-brother's eyes were a summer color that turned winter when they were angry. "He goes to Dragonstone. He will stand for Stannis. He asks that we hold fast and not give the lions the fight they want until the River Lords and the Vale and the rest can turn this into more than a meal." Jon looked down at his own hands and saw dirt in the lines at the base of his fingers that would not wash out with words. "I will not leave the Night's Watch," he said, as if another boy's heart hadn't leapt in his chest at the thought of saddle leather and winter sun in his eyes, at the thought of a sword in his hand for his father and his pack. "I can't." Robb smiled a little. "I didn't ask you to. Father would scowl at me if I did." "He would," Jon said, and felt it like warmth. Ghost put his head under Jon's hand then and sneezed at the smell of smoke that drifted through from the kitchens. Somewhere in the background, a girl laughed, and it took Jon a moment to realize it was Bran's laughter, high and startling like the crack of ice, coming from a memory and not the air. "Winter is coming," Robb said, because they said it to each other when there was nothing else to say that would not break something. He put a hand on Jon's shoulder and squeezed once. It felt like the old days when they had wrestled in straw and called it practice. Weeks passed like clods kicked from a boot. Dragonstone's harbor filled with ships whose sails had been mended by women with sore fingers and patched with cloth that didn't care whose colors it used to be, because wind didn't. Davos drilled men who were sailors first and soldiers second, which meant they were whatever the weather made of them. Stannis stared at the painted table until the paint pretended it was the real thing. Eddard wrote letters to men who would not have expected letters from a northerner. To Yohn Royce in the Vale, whose armor was a book of history and whose patience was a spear. To Hoster Tully and his captains, to the Lords Manderley and Glover and Tallheart, to the Iron Bank because coin had a law of its own and moved armies quicker than honor sometimes did. He wrote to Lisa Arryn. He chose his words as carefully as he had chosen a wife once. He did not write of Jon's death or the milk or the whispering of old crimes. He wrote of the boy at the Eyrie with his mother's thin wrists and his father's last name and the duty that belonged to what remained of them. He wrote of hawks. He wrote of the cost of hiding on high places. He did not ask for her nights. He asked for her memory. Lisa's reply came as if it had been walked over mountains by a fearful girl who tried to throw it away and failed. It said very little, and most of that was very sharp. It said the veil would remain a nest, not a spear. It said that the world below was a bad song. But there was a crack in the lines, a little naked place where something honest looked out and dared not stay. Eddard did not let himself peer through. A man could fall down a hole that small. Jon Royce came to Gulltown with his winged helm and his eyes that could count every sparrow in a hedgerow when it flew. He brought men. Not enough to tilt the realm. Enough to make men notice that someone old and stubborn had moved and would not move back. He did not bring Lisa with him. Perhaps he could not have. Perhaps he chose not to. Ned had known men like Jon, men who had learned that sometimes you did what a lady wanted and sometimes you did what her lord would have wanted if he had been living when the doing needed doing. They did not call it rebellion. They called it custody. When the first of Stannis' galleys nosed into Blackwater Bay, Tyrion Lannister stood on a bastion and watched through a painter's glass as if the enemy were a parade. The sea looked flat and harmless. Only fools believed that. He had men posted along the Mud Gate and the King's Gate and the Lion Gate. He had the chain. He had the wildfire. He had a sister who insisted on keeping her boy in sight because she had learned the worst lesson from their father. That love could be mistaken for ownership and ownership for safety. He had the Hound, who hated fire and had more courage than most men he'd met, which was saying little for men or much for Sandor Clegane. "What do you think?" Bronn asked, leaning on embrasure stone with a casual slouch that would have offended a septa, a lord, and an officer in equal measures. "I think I will wish I had learned to pray properly before the night is out," Tyrion said. "And I think that even if I had, it would make very little difference." He sent the first boats with their sickly cargo slipping down the current under black canvas. Stannis' oars flashed. The bay found a voice and shouted. The chain lay beneath water like a sea serpent's spine, waiting for the moment when it would rise and shut the mouth that had swallowed those boats. On the walls above the Red Keep, Sansa Stark watched too. She had been told she should pray. She prayed. She prayed to every god she knew, and to some she did not like much. She prayed to the god that watched over the cold water in Winterfell's Godswood, and to the hot one that the Red Woman set her king beside like a brazier. She did not ask for Joffrey's death. She did not ask for his life. She asked to be taken home, which was a child's prayer, and she knew it, and she made it anyway. The first flare of green that rose from the surface of the river made men cry out in the voice of children and horses together. The second made men run. The third did what the first two had been meant to make possible. It set the bay on fire in a sheet. The chain rose with a groan like an old giant waking and shut behind Stannis' forward ships like a trap. Men burned. Men drowned. Men climbed burning timbers and fought each other for space there because there was space nowhere else. Tyrion did not watch long. He had to move men like pieces on his own painted table, and the pieces screamed and bled and rolled dice where he told them to. He led a sortie because he knew if he did not, those he had bought would spend their sold loyalty elsewhere. He found himself bleeding and laughing both, and he hated the part of him that laughed. He saw the Hound take a step back from a gout of flame and then another, and he saw fear unhorse the man where swords could not. He saw Joffrey go inside as ordered and look relieved and angry at once. He saw the red in the sky deepen to the black that means morning will be late. He saw Stannis come ashore, grim and drenched, and fight as if every man who died at his orders were a sack of grain he had paid too much for. He fought like a man who had never laughed at a feast and never meant to. Tyrion felt himself admire him in a way that had nothing to do with liking. The night lasted 3 days. When morning came at last, it was red and gold, and smelled of pitch and cooked meat. The chain was broken, not by cunning but by stubbornness, the sort of stubbornness that breaks many things, including men who have it. The towers near the river were black mouths. The fleet had been chewed. Stannis still had enough. He had enough to push through streets that had learned to be narrow for battle and broad for mobs. He had enough to send Davos Seaworth cutting a path to the Mud Gate with men who would not much outlive their glory. When the city's gates fell, Joffrey Baratheon learned what a throne is made from. He learned it very quickly. He learned it in the space of time between one door opening and another closing on him. Cersei pulled him towards the Red Keep's inner ways. Pycelle waddled behind them, whispering history too low for anyone to hear. The Hound had gone. He had looked into flame and seen his childhood again and left as if a dog had snapped his chain because it was burning him. The King's Guard scattered like dice. Sansa hid where she had been told to hide, and when the door opened, it was not her lion but an older lion, thin, white-haired, eyes like dry stone. Ser Barristan Selmy had come to escort a queen once. Now he came for a girl because he had counted debts and found the numbers wrong. "Come," he said, and it was not a command. It was an arm. He took her down passages that had never learned daylight. He took her to a postern where a boat waited. Just a boat, no pennant, no dignity, just wood. A man with salt on his skin steadied her as she stepped in. When she looked up, the man looked back at her with eyes that had seen storms and tea. Hot little of them. There was kindness in those eyes, but not softness. It was Davos Seaworth, though she did not know his name then. "Keep your head down, my lady," he said gently, and when she opened her mouth to tell him she was not his lady, she realized she wanted to be anyone's lady who would speak to her like that. They rode along a city that burned and bled and screamed, and the river carried ashes of men and the teeth of ships. Above them, banners fell and rose. The boat slid into the shadow of a galley with black sails and a banner that held a bend crowned by a flaming heart. Sansa looked at it and then at her own hands and thought of her mother's sewing basket. How her mother had always chosen her thread carefully. They took her aboard and wrapped her in a blanket that smelled of tar and wool and honesty. When she set foot on Dragonstone's quay days later, she was no longer certain what to do with her spine. It had learned to be stiff and had not learned to rest again. The reunion in the Great Hall was not a thing that belongs in songs because songs lie about sound. When Eddard saw Sansa, he stopped being Lord of Winterfell for a breath and became a man whose heart had been kept too long in a cage. He held her. He did not say her name twice or 3 times, as men in songs do. He said it once, and it was enough to tell the room everything. Sansa did not cry like girls in plays. She cried like rain that had waited in a cloud that had learned to be hard. Stannis did not watch long. He was a man who had learned to respect privacy even as he broke it for law. Davos stood at his shoulder and did the watching for him, because someone ought to record what the world gave back. Cersei did not go to Dragonstone. She went to a narrow room where the light was bad and the air was worse. She went there because Stannis said she would and because he had men with pikes to encourage her. She spoke to him with words she had polished for years on the whetstone of her hate. Stannis took them as if they were dues and returned a receipt. "You'll die for this," she said. "We all die," he answered evenly. "Some of us prefer to choose the reason." He did not kill her that day. He locked her up and promised her judgment at daylight when daylight meant something. He did not enjoy mercy. He did not despise it either. He liked rules, and mercy was a rule in some books. He set Janos Slynt for the block, and that was an easier weight in his hand. He gave the command to the man who had bought the city watch with coin and found himself bankrupt in honor. The crowd that came to watch Slynt die did not cheer loudly, but there were smiles after that, had no mirth and much relief. Tyrion woke in a bed that was not his, with his face bandaged and his head full of bees. He had killed men. He had saved men. He had lost a city. He could not make himself ashamed of the first 2. He found himself odd in his calm for the 3rd. "You live," Varys murmured at his bedside, and the word laid a cloth over a wound that still oozed. "For how long?" Tyrion asked. "Is there an edict? Did Stannis sign something with a flourish and a blot?" "Stannis has very tidy hands," Varys said. "He has signed very little. Lord Stark does much of the writing. Your sister is secured. Your king pardon. The boy will stand before a court." "That will go well," Tyrion said, and laughed and winced. "Tell me something true, Varys." "The realm is tired," Varys said. "It is a tired man who makes mistakes, and a tired man who forgives them. We will see what sort of men govern us now." On a morning when the sea lay smooth as oiled slate and the wind did not yet know which mischief it would choose, The court convened in the hall at Dragonstone around a table that had once been a map and was now pretend again. Stannis listened to charges spoken plain, and he did not enjoy the speaking. He called witnesses. He did not allow catcalls. He asked Sansa once if she wished to speak. She looked at him as if he were a cliff she had to climb to see home and shook her head very small. He nodded. He called Ser Barristan, who spoke as if he were sharpening a sword with each word. He called Pycelle, who trembled like a dog that knows its owner brought a stick. He called men who had carried bodies through smoke. He called Davos Seaworth, who had been at gates and on water both and could not be accused of loving anyone present. At the end, he did not give a speech. He said, "We will keep the law," and pronounced judgment. Joffrey Baratheon would lose his crown. That was the easy part. As to his head, Stannis gave what the law demanded for treason and murder both. He gave the Night's Watch a choice. They refused. They had no desire for the boy who had sneered at them at feast and pissed on them by policy. Stannis nodded and made the choice himself. He did not make a spectacle. He did not smile. The boy died badly because boys do. There was no poetry in it. Cersei watched with eyes as flat as the bay. She did not scream. She did not faint. She swallowed something, and whatever it was took up residence in her and would not leave. She asked to see her brother, and Tyrion went to her because Tyrion had always been a fool for family. "You might have saved him," she said. "I might have made myself die alongside him," Tyrion said gently. "Then you would have had the pleasure of 3 graves." "You smile," she breathed. "You always smile." "I smile because I don't want to cry," he said, and left her because there is a kind of kindness that is not mercy. Letters went out like birds with bells. The Vale sent more men under Yohn Royce because the sight of law being kept had reminded men of what it felt like. The Riverlands sent more because the sight of a lion's head in a basket made a better argument than a speech. Tywin Lannister drew back to the west with his banners arranged like teeth and his grief allowed only to himself. He would not forgive. He would wait. He would spend the rest of his life making the world pay a bill it did not understand it had run up. Robb Stark rode at last because there was riding to do that mended instead of breaking. He brought his banners to a ford and found the phrase had suddenly remembered hospitality. He crossed with courtesies that were bitter and necessary both. He did not promise marriage with his mouth full. He learned to use ink as a sword and a clasped hand as a mace. He found himself in a command tent with his uncle's laughter and his mother's silence and the night talking coldly beyond the canvas. He listened to Roose Bolton's counsel and did not take it when his mother's eyes told him there were knives in that velvet. The Ironborn came like winter birds when men were least in the mood for them. Pike's kraken unfurled on shores that did not want decorations. The North learned what happens when your back is turned to the sea and your front is turned to the south for too long. Theon Greyjoy went home and found himself smaller there than he had ever felt in Winterfell, which made him dangerous to himself and others. He took a choice in his mouth and chewed it. He made a castle his, briefly, and in so doing lost any claim to being a man anyone would trust where there were children in the yard. Ned heard the raven on Dragonstone's parapet and held his breath while he untied the ribbon. He read of Winterfell taken and bent his head for a very long time. He read of Bran and Rickon and the news that came with a seal he did not recognize and which he refused to believe because a father's disbelief has kept the world from ending more times than the gods will ever write down. He sent ravens like hail. He sent Davos with a letter to White Harbor because he had learned once that a man with a boat could do more for a country than an army on the wrong road. He sent word to the Wall because the Wall had always been his, in some portion, and because he had begun to dream of snow that moved with purpose. When Sansa came to him one afternoon and stood in the doorway and did not speak, he put aside his letters. He had learned to do that thing. There was a time when work had been the only thing that kept men he cared for fed. Now there were other kinds of hunger. He would not give them all to the realm. He waited. "Father," she said softly, and then, "I would like to go home." He rose and went to her. He took her by the shoulders because hugging her felt like something he should ask for, and he would not ask anything of his daughter for a while yet. "We will," he said. "It will take longer than we like. We will." She nodded. She didn't cry. The girl who had been a girl in King's Landing had learned a new way to hold water in her eyes. "Arya?" she asked, the way a man asks a healer if he will lose the limb. "I don't know," Ned said, and gave her the only gift Starks give their children, truth. "But Yoren is stubborn, and the gods do not hate me enough to give me only one daughter back." On a night when the weather turned and the wind remembered where north was, Jon Snow stood atop the wall and watched the forest below move like black breath. Ghost stood with him because Ghost did not leave him unless told, and because the wall still took company from things that walked without sound and left no print that melted. "Do you ever think of them?" Samwell Tarly asked. Sam had climbed well today. He had not cried once. He asked wearily, bravely, "Your brothers, your sisters." "Every day," Jon said. "It doesn't help much, so I stop for a while." "They say there's a king in the south who's not wicked," Sam said with a sort of prominent hesitance, as if he didn't want to hurt the words. "They say your father is with him." "They say many things," Jon said. "Some of them are true, some are useful, some are both."
Sam shivered.
"Sometimes I think there's a king in the woods," he whispered, and Jon knew he did not mean Mance Rayder. He meant the Cold King, the one the stories had made out of winter itself. The one old Nan had whispered about in a voice that turned candles into listenings. "Then we will hold the wall," Jon said. They stood until their faces burned with cold and the night made a crown of their breath. Far south, men measured corals with gold and blood and found both expensive. Far north, the world measured itself and decided what it would give, which was very little, and what it would take, which was a great deal. When spring came, if it came, it would come like an apology. For now, it was a question. The question sharpened men into different shapes. Stannis sent Davos to White Harbor and found a friend there with a cook's smile and a banker's memory. Wyman Manderly heard of a law kept and thought of his own laws. He made oaths because oaths fit him. He liked their taste. Stannis sent knights up the King's Road with carts not of soldiers but of grain. It did him more good than 10 grips on 10 swords would have done. He made Pycelle shuffle home to Old Town on a donkey because the man's learning had become a lever that moved only his own chair, and said the Citadel could spare him no longer. He gave Varys leave to stay, which was either wisdom or folly or both. A realm learns you need the spiders even while you hate the webs. He named Eddard his hand in truth and had a new chair built that did not have lion heads on the arms. Catelyn came to Dragonstone with Robb and a host that had learned to look like part of the land it moved through. She came beneath sails and above fears she had counted like coins every night she hadn't slept. The day she put her kerchief aside and took Ned in her arms in a hall that had seen only men clutching ambition and women wearing it like jewelry, the world gave back a half measure of what it had taken. Half measures were the best the world knew how to give. Robb bowed to Stannis. He did not kneel quickly. He did not kneel grudgingly. He knelt like a man who had chosen to bend in this one place and would not bend again except where he found the ground worth kissing. Great Jon Umber grinned, because he liked men who chose their words and their wars both. Roose Bolton's eyes gave away nothing, but Roose Bolton's eyes never had. Letters went west. Tywin read them in a room that smelled of ink and tallow and quiet fury. He did not come to the city. He drew his banners tighter. He sent envoys with lips full of courtesy and pockets full of knives. He learned patience from a younger man and hated it. Theon stood in a godswood that was not a godswood and promised a tree that he would not break. And then he broke because a man in the grip of his own idea of himself is the weakest thing in any room. He lost Winterfell and found something worse in himself. Ramsay Snow came like a worm into a wound and turned it maggot. The North would take a long time to heal. In the Vale, Lisa Arryn stood by a moon door and forced herself to look down because a man she had loved in the terrible way women sometimes love had been thrown into a hall and cut from the world. The wind off the mountains tasted clean. She felt dirty. The Lords Declarant came with their ancient prudence and asked her to be less alone. She did not know how. She told them she would consider winter when it wrote her a letter. Jon Royce asked to see his young lord. She let him because some choices give you back sleep. Across a sea that had taught her the names of storms, a girl with silver hair and 3 small dragons walked through a city that had the smell of new metal being bent. Her arc bent towards Westeros like a bowstring pulled very slowly. She heard of a lawful king who had taken a city she had been told belonged to her. She heard of a wolf lord with a face like a winter morning standing at the king's shoulder. She watched her dragons fight over a piece of meat and thought of law and fire and what they do when they share a table. On a night of thin moon, Eddard Stark walked alone to the battlements of Dragonstone and leaned on the carved stone as if it might learn his weight and share it. The sea spoke the way the sea always spoke, of the old world under the waves, of drowned trees, of fish that had never seen the sun. The wind pulled at his hair. He thought of ice sitting back in Winterfell, a blade that had written his family's history for centuries and had now learned to rust because it was not being asked to do what it had been made to do. He thought of the weight of a sword and of a sentence. He touched his neck where Peter's knife had kissed him and left a line he would carry to the pyre. "Honesty," Stannis said from behind him, his footsteps a confession. "It has cost me more soldiers than the enemy." Ned turned. In the moon's poor light, the king looked more himself than he did by day. Tired, hard, unstinting. "It has cost me much," Ned agreed. "But I would find I was no longer myself if I stopped paying." Stannis came to his side and put both hands on the stone. They stood like that for a while, two men who had learned the same lessons differently. "The north burns," Stannis said. "I will go there. I will go when the west is quiet enough to let me. The wall matters more than all these chairs we fight over. I have a red priestess who thinks the wall is a candle to be lit. I have a smuggler who thinks it is a cliff to stand on. I have you who think it is both and neither. That may be enough." Ned did not nod because the truth did not need help. "I will go north when I can. My place is there when the world remembers what cold can do." "You killed a man," Stannis said then, with no ceremony. "It changed things. I prefer when things change because I tell them to." Ned made a breath into something like a laugh. "Aye, so do I." They watched the night, and the night watched them back with those billion cold eyes. In the east, the faintest bruise of light gathered. The world was a place where a girl could be stolen and found, where a man could be betrayed and live, where a city could burn and still expect morning. It was a place where law was a kind of fire that warmed more than it burned when men remembered to keep it small and constant. In the forests beyond the wall, something moved. It did not hate. It did not love. It remembered. It remembered a world where men were a rumor at the edges and winter wrote in bold lines across the map. It began to write again. When the ravens came with word that Tywin Lannister had withdrawn from Harrenhal and taken his fires west to consolidate a realm that slept with knives under its pillows, Eddard set his seal to orders that did not glimmer and would change more than any victory at a gate. Grain to the riverlands, fair judges to towns that had learned to expect none. He sent Sansa north under guard that would get her there whole, not proud. He kissed her brow in the curtain morning and watched her go with a look that made men want to look away. Catelyn went with her as far as White Harbor to pay a debt in person to a man who enjoyed debts and roasted beef in equal measure. Robb remained to learn the taste of counsel where it was not given by those who loved him. Tyrion took ship the next month, not for the Rock. He would not have lasted to the bay, but for a small port where news was loud and gravity light. He thought of staying where his wit would buy him as much as gold. He thought of a woman with black hair and no mercy. He thought of returning when the world had changed enough to allow it. He drank one last cup with Bronn and told him not to get himself killed for a purse not worth the blade that would be stuck in him. Bronn grinned and promised nothing. In a hall of cold stone, Stannis Baratheon put his hand on a table made into a map and did not smile when men cheered the thought of quiet. He did not love quiet. He loved order. He had found in Eddard Stark a man who could stand beside him without flinching at the price of it. He had found in the realm a kind of breath that could be kept, if guarded. He would set his face north soon, because a king that kept his vows to the dead by holding the line for the living was the only sort he could bear to be. And Eddard Stark, who had once told a boy that the one who judges must swing the sword, had begun again to feel the pull of a blade named not for a river or a city but for a season. He lay at night in a chamber that had once held brothers who had starved under siege, and recalled a courtyard in Winterfell where snow fell soft and kind and made men believe the world had mercy hidden in it. In dreams, ice waited in its place. In waking, he remembered the day in the throne room when he had broken his own law for the sake of law and cut a man down without lifting the greatsword he had inherited. He would carry that until he died. He did not repent it. He accepted the weight. The girl with the wolf's eyes ran through a tangle of men and roads and wasn't caught by any of them. She learned names and took them and put them down again. She made lists. She shortened them. She remembered a wooden sword tapping her knuckles in a long room and a man from the sea who had told her to see the world as water. She let it flow around her and struck where it was soft. The world moved. It moved slower than men wished and faster than they were ready for. It remembered what had been done in a throne room that smelled of oil and dust and cold iron. It remembered a head rolling and blood gleaming like a jewel against a dark floor. Some men called it murder, some justice, some chance. The old gods and the new, who did not speak to each other except in storms, did not call it anything. They remembered only that a man had made a choice not because it would make him safe, but because it would make the world truer. Those choices are like stones thrown in very still lakes. The ripples move long after the thrower is gone. Winter watched, patient as it always did. It sent scouts ahead of itself down cold rivers and up old roads. It slipped fingers into gaps beneath doors. It learned names in the south: Stannis, Eddard, Sansa, Jon, and carried them in frost like charms. It does not hate. It does not love. It comes. One night, after the raven came from White Harbor saying the girl had passed on and the snow had begun with its first quiet trod on Dragonstone's old towers, Ned Stark went again to the wall that looked over sea. He stood there without words because he had used all his words for letters and laws. Stannis came and did not speak either. The wind brought them salt. In the east, a faint light gathered that might have been dawn or the memory of all the Dawn's men had ever deserved. The two men stood together and did not plan, did not decree, did not judge. They did what men do when the world is very large and they are very small. They stayed. Far to the north, on a height of ice that had outlasted more kings than bards could count, Jon Snow looked west along the wall and saw, for a moment, a line of shadows moving where no torches burned. He felt ghost press against him and did not smile. He touched the rough stone with his palm. It was cold and indifferent. It gave back nothing but its own honesty. It was enough. There would be wars to come that had nothing to do with lions and wolves and everything to do with men learning again how to be warm. There would be treaties signed with hands that shook from more than age. There would be a girl crossing a sea with fire that could cook a world or warm it, and there would be a smuggler in a boat with a lantern and a prayer. There would be a man with a scar on his neck who woke sometimes with his hand at his throat, and there would be a sword taken down from its hooks at last and set to work again. There would be snow. The day Eddard Stark led his daughter through the gates of Winterfell once more, the sky wore a color he had not seen since he had left. Blue that thought about breaking, white that thought about staying, sun that had learned to go about its business without looking any man in the eye. The people came, and they did not cheer in the way southern cities do. They smiled in tight ways and nodded once and went to their chores with straighter backs. That was better. He carried no sword across the yard. He did not need to. The gods would made it sound, water talking through stone. The heart tree stood with its red leaves like hands frozen under water. He knelt, though his knee told him what it thought of that. He let Sansa stand beside him. She put her hand on his head with the shyness of someone touching a sleeping dog. He laughed then, softly. The sound surprised them both. The war was not over. It might never be over. The realm had been reminded that law could be a shelter instead of a cudgel. The winter coming would test whether men had remembered well enough. A man had made a choice in a hall where knives pretended to be a throne. A girl had run and been found. A king had been chosen by law instead of appetite. A chain had risen from a river. A fire had eaten ships. The sea went on speaking in its language. The trees went on watching. And far away, where salt blew over cities with names no Stark had ever learned, A woman walked towards a wind that smelled of smoke and salt and promised her a continent. Her dragons cried. She smiled. The world did not know whether to be afraid or hopeful. It scarcely mattered. It would learn. The snow began again, soft as breath, and lay on stone that had seen blood and born men and women alike. Ned held his daughter's hand and thought of sons, and of another daughter with a sword that looked like a needle. He thought of the wall like a promise kept because someone had to keep it. He breathed in air he had missed since the day he had left it. He let it out slow. The man who had passed the sentence and not swung the sword stood where the sword would soon enough be needed. He had a king who understood the cost of justice and the weight of mercy. He had a realm that might heal if it did not open its wounds again out of habit. He had winter in his lungs. He had time enough to do what must be done. For now, he had a girl at his side and a tree before him and a sky over both. It was enough.